Hey guys, it's Eric with Team Flex Innovations here, and I wanted to make this video to talk about the mixing I did on my RV8 70cc G2 from Flex Innovations, and how I set up my live wing, which is full span ailerons, full flap mixing, and crow mixing. So I do this kind of in a standard way in terms of the actual flap movement, the crow movement as well, but the big thing I want to talk about here is trimming it. Sorry about the screen brightness; it does that sometimes. But I want to talk about how I trim it, because I don't do flap to elevator mixing. I retrim the plane for each flight mode. So I want to kind of talk about why I do that, as well as how I did the logic switches to get these flight modes working, because there's some kind of different methods there. So the first thing I want to talk about is the flight modes and the trimming, because it's something I think more people should look into. It makes the setup really easy when you're doing your maiden flight. And if you ever need to tune your mixing, it makes it a lot quicker. So what a lot of people do is, if we go to our mixing here, you see I have my flap mix here, and I also have, aileron elevator. What a lot of people do is they make another mix that is for your flap to elevator compensation. You activate it with your flap switch, and you set that up then as a curve. Maybe you use a var, which is a variable, and you use like maybe these buttons to adjust it on the fly. That works, but I've noticed sometimes that if you don't have everything set up absolutely perfectly in terms of like your flap deflection, like on each side, or your elevator deflection, like if your turnbuckles aren't exactly the same, maybe your elevators aren't perfectly in sync. An issue you have sometimes is the plane isn't tracking perfectly the same in terms of like aileron or rudder when you engage your flaps. So that's where using the trims can help with that. So the way we do this is we have different flight modes here. So you have your normal flight, your mid flap, full flap, and crow mode. So one thing I do want to mention here quick is crow is only enabled when the flaps are all the way down. It's basically like putting the air brakes on when you use it. It's kind of cool because I can go straight down diving at the ground and the plane doesn't pick up speed. It's really fun to play with, but you don't need it on mid flaps. You only need it sometimes on full flaps, and I want to be able to turn that on and off. I use this switch right here to be able to do that. I also have the switch here. SB is my flap switch, and SA is for my full span ailerons. We'll talk about that stuff more later. The first thing I want to talk about here, like I said, is the flight modes. So the flight modes here, you can see normal flight is basically the default flight mode that comes pre-programmed, I guess, on when you set up a model. So that whenever another flight mode isn't on or enabled, this normal flight mode is going to be active. And I use that to my advantage, so when none of my flaps are configured, then that normal flight mode is on. Because I do have a high rate and a medium rate. That way if someone else is flying the airplane, they have a more gentle set of rates they can fly on to get used to it. But when I'm using those, there's no reason for me to have to trim the plane for each of those, because all I'm doing is I'm adding a little more throw, or I'm adding maybe full span ailerons or something like that. So there's no need for the trimming. So all my flight modes and stuff, or my dual rates, excuse me, are handled just through each mix right here. You can see I've got my different curves for expo, even though I keep my expo the same. That allows me to change it per flight mode if I want to. And my rates. Now, I get there's different ways you can do this with logic switches and stuff, but just for my setups, this is kind of the fastest and easiest way that I do it. So I set my weight, or the rates, whatever you like to call it, to 100% for my high rate. I'll adjust my endpoints in the outputs page to set on my min and max, as well as my PWM center. I use that for as well. But that way I'm using all of the curve here. Oops. use all of the stick travel on high rate, uses the full range of it, nothing's dumbed down electronically. And then if I want to go to medium rate or something, it's there as well. It's just I reduce the weight in the actual like aileron mix or elevator mix. So I got that out of the way. I want to talk about these flight modes some more, because that is kind of an interesting way of doing it. Because normally you can just set each flight mode to be triggered by one active condition. In this case, for the mid flaps, it's when the switch is in the middle.
Flaps mid.
Now that works great unless you have something like crow, because you can have full flaps without the ailerons going up, which would be crow off, or you can have the ailerons go up when your flaps go down, which is crow on. So I can't just have a crow flight mode that is activated when this switch is down, because it'll override maybe my full flap flight mode, and then the flaps and stuff act up. And the only reason my flaps work is because of this flight mode. So in order to do this, I made use of the logic switches built into the Frsky radio system to achieve this. So you can see here, there's 4 logic switches, and all of them are grayed out. That means they're not active currently. And I do this basically because I don't want these active at all unless the switch is in the right position, because then it's going to change my flight mode, and I don't want my flight mode to change. So the first one I'm going to talk about here is these middle 2. So what this is basically an AND logic switch. Now, if you don't know what that means, basically in terms of like computer programming, you have to have item 1 be true and item 2 also to be true for your logic switch to turn on or be true. So in this case, I'll turn my volume down here quick. The first thing is switch SB, my flap switch, needs to be in the full flap position. Now, that'll start the logic switch on. As you can see, it turned green here. Now, the other part of it is the switch right here, SD. Now, this, like I said, is my crow switch. So when the switch is in the down position, it turns the crow on. But if it's in the middle position or the up position, I don't want the crow to be on. So that's where these 2 logic switches come into play, is if this switch is up and my flap switch SB is down, it's going to turn this logic switch on. Now that's the reason I named it full flap flight mode up, is basically saying that this crow mode is off, but the switch is in the up position. Now, unfortunately, with this being a 3-position switch, that means I also have the middle position to worry about. Now, if that switch is in the middle position, you can see the logic switch turned off. So therefore, my full flap flight mode is not engaged, even though I have my flaps in the down position. So that's where I make this next one right here. This is basically the same logic switch. It's the same style with an AND statement. Same thing with the SB switch being down, my flap switch. But the way this one is true is if the crow switch, as I'll call it, this SD is in the middle position. So that one will turn on when we have the crow switch in the middle. And we don't typically keep it in the middle. This is more kind of an accidental thing. If for whatever reason I have it down, let's say I had the crow on and I flip it up and I only get it one spot, and I don't want the crow, but I still want the flaps, then the flaps will still work. It's not like it's going to just shut my flaps off. So that was the idea with that logic switch right there. Now, the third one here is called full flap flight mode. Now, this is a little bit different. So this is an exclusive OR switch. Now, what that is the idea is you take an OR statement in like computer programming or something. The way these are true is if one item is true and the other one is false, the logic switch is true. If both of them are true, it's going to be false. And that's where the exclusive OR part comes in. If neither of them are true or both of them are true, it's going to be false. if one of them is true and the other one is false, or vice versa, say the first one is true, second one's false, the logic switch will turn on. If the second one is true and the first one's false, it'll also turn on. So this is the full flap flight mode logic switch that no matter what, if my flap switch is in the full flap position, no matter what, if this crow switch is up or in the middle, it's still going to be on because either one of those earlier logic switches I created are on and active. Therefore, each of my values is those first logic switches. So you can see where the full flap, full flap flight mode up, now that one's active. If the switch comes into the middle, full flap flight mode middle turns on, the other one turns off. See, the logic switch still stays green here. See, when I flip it back and forth, it's still green. Now, if I go to crow mode, which is, again, bringing this switch all the way down, it turns red. Therefore, it shuts the switch off. Now, it's green again because I brought the switch back up, but if I bring my flap switch up, it's red again. So this way, as long as my flap switch is down and my crow is not enabled, I'm going to have full flaps. Now, the final logic switch here is just called the crow flight mode switch, is what I named it. And this is just, again, like the first two I talked about, just an AND logic switch that's saying if the flap is down and my crow switch is down, we'll turn that logic switch on. So that way, the crow will come on when I want it, but if I flip the crow off, but I leave the flaps down, the crow will be off, but I'll still have the flaps from my other logic switches here. So if I kind of click away and come back here, you can see here how this works where I go middle flap, we don't have anything because I don't need a logic switch for that middle position as that's a separate flight mode. Same with it being up, that's the default flight mode like I talked about earlier. If I come all the way down, you see the full flap one enables for the logic switch based on the positions, and the actual flight mode full flap logic switch is also on. And switch it to the middle, you can see the middle logic switch changes, but my actual flight mode logic switch at the bottom stays the same. So coming back here now, we can look at these flight modes again, and we can see how this works. So my full flap flight mode is just the same as any other flight mode, but instead of it being active on a switch position, it's activated off of a logic switch here. And this is that full flap flight mode, that bottom one we were just looking at. So again, if the flap switch is down and this crow switch is in the middle or top position, this flight mode is going to be active. Now, the crow switch is the same idea here. It's just controlled by that crow logic switch. So you can see when it comes down, it goes bold, meaning our flight mode is active. You can see here, if I click away from it, get the highlight off, you can see that one's active because it's got the bright letters. There's the mid flap. I bring the switch back up. There I have full flaps. Bring it to the middle. Still full flaps no matter what position of the two it's in. And then I can enable crow when it comes all the way down. So that's how I do my flight modes. Now when I was talking about the trim, that here, all it is it's basically just the mode for the rudder, the elevator, and the ailerons. That is just set to independent per flight mode instead of, say, easy mode. And what easy mode is just each flight mode, the trim remains the same. When it's in this independent per flight mode, when you change flight modes, your trim's going to reset. You have to retrim your plane. But in this case, I use that to basically be my elevator compensation. So I can use my main trimmers here and adjust my trim just like I would, say, just like a maiden flight, where you're doing the trims initially. It's the same process. I don't have any extra buttons I need to worry about. Just trim it like normal. I just happen to be having my flaps down, I don't have to worry about editing another mix. I just, like I said, do it on the trims, and that takes care of that. So the final thing I kind of wanted to talk about here is the mixing within the mixing, I guess. In my mixes page, I'm talking about the crow here. This is just saying when the active condition for it is SD down, turning, again, the crow on. The input here is SB. So that is saying, you know, what I'm trying to say here is this is controlling how much the ailerons move. So I made a curve here. So if I go to the curve here, it's a 3-point curve. It's a custom curve, and all it is just 3 points here. So when SB is up, it's all the way on the left side here. When it's in the middle, it's right there. And when it's all the way down, it's all the way on the right side. So all this is basically at 0%, my ailerons are in the center. And when it's at 60%, the ailerons go up. So this is just saying when the switch moves between places, I can not have any aileron movement here because they're at 0. And when it goes all the way down, it's going to kick the ailerons up. And this is activated by switch SD being down. This is actually what controls the crow. I forgot to mention this earlier, but all this flight mode stuff I have been talking about, all that is doing is allowing me to trim it on the trim switches instead of having to make a separate mix and have to use like my VAR buttons or just do the guess and check with the flap to elevator compensation mix. This is actually what's controlling the crow or the ailerons going up. So other than that, the only other thing we have here is an aileron to flap mix. This is my full span aileron mix. So because I set up my ailerons and my flaps identically in terms of linkage geometry and everything, I don't have to worry about balancing the channels. All I have to do is make this mix where the active condition is SA down. That turns the mix on. That's when I want full span ailerons, and it just mixes the ailerons and flaps. So the flap channels are controlled by the aileron channel. You can see here I set my expo just like the other surfaces, as now these flaps are acting like ailerons. You want the same expo, so they're balanced all the same. So that's all that is. Weight's 100 because I'm only flying crow on high rates. I only fly on high rates. So I could set up, you know, that 80% weight controlled by switch E if I wanted to, and to make them even. But we're only really flying this plane on high rates. We just have the option of low rates. So that's all that is saying here. You got the two outputs or the two flaps. They're reversed, so you have them moving in the right direction. But otherwise, that's pretty much it in terms of programming the flaps and ailerons and all the mixing that goes there. I really just wanted to make sure I talked about the setup in terms of the flight modes because it's kind of confusing when you're thinking like, oh, I have to have all these logic switches just to be able to trim my airplane. Now, like I said, you don't have to do it this way. The awesome part about the Ethos operating system and the FreeSky radios in general is you have all this customization. There is probably a better way to do this, but this way works really well for me, and I've had a lot of success with it. I've been really happy with how the RV8 flies and being able to use these mixes. It made it so simple. I didn't have to worry on the maiden flight about trying to remember, does this button change my mixing up or down, or do I have to click a separate button? It was just like, oh, okay, I want to go to my flap. Okay, we'll just retrim it out. Now it's nice and level again. And if I ever need to change it, I don't need to worry about activating or deactivating VARs or anything. It's all just on my trims. I can adjust it on the fly if I need to. If it's really windy, I need a little more help pushing the nose down, I've got it. It's right on tap there. So it's really easy in those terms to be able to set up your flight modes. So if anyone wants, please feel free to reach out to me on Facebook or Instagram or anything. I'll leave links to my Facebook and Instagram page down below. If you guys want the model file, I'll be happy to send it your way. Just so you guys can look at it and reference it, whatever you want there. If you got any other questions about programming, even doesn't have to be related to the RV or programming, anything, feel free to reach out. I love helping others. That's one of my favorite parts of the hobby. That's honestly, that's a big reason why I do it. So with that being said, we'll cut to the actual video of me demonstrating these mixes in action on the plane. And yeah, so thank you for watching. Sorry for this being such a long video, but it's kind of a complicated topic in its own way to explain. But once you do it, or once you kind of look through it, pause the screen, look at what each mix is and how it's set up, hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. And hopefully if you guys do have a plane like this, or it doesn't even have to be an RV8, something similar, hopefully this will work for you guys. So thank you guys for watching. And like I said, if you got any questions, feel free to message me, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube comments. Doesn't matter. I'll do my best to get back to you. So thank you.